two countries divided by centuries of rivalry and warfare, and by 34 kilometers of treacherous open sea. It was a radical idea to dig a tunnel connecting them 100 meters below the rocky seabed. At stake, billions of pounds and the lives of 8,000 tunnellers. If it worked, it would be the world's longest undersea tunnel. But with terrifying floods, a horrific fire, and financial meltdown, the Channel Tunnel would dice with disaster right from the start. This train is making an extraordinary journey that will take it under the surface of the Earth, through one of the world's biggest man-made structures. Engineers call it one of the 7 wonders of the modern world. The Channel Tunnel took 7 years to construct and devoured 1 million tons of concrete, enough to build the Empire State Building 3 times over. Europe, the nations of Britain and France. Since Ice Age glaciers melted 13,000 years ago, they've been separated by this formidable body of water, the English Channel. At 34 kilometers across, it's twice as wide as the Grand Canyon. The two nations spent hundreds of years at war, right up to the last century. For many on both sides, it's still a love-hate relationship. So the idea of an undersea tunnel to link these one-time foes caused controversy. But the massive trade boost for both countries was an irresistible incentive. In 1986, British Premier Thatcher and French Premier Mitterrand agreed to build the Channel Tunnel. But the total £3 billion budget was put up entirely by private finance. December 1987. The big dig begins. Heading underground were 2 armies of excavators, each over 4,000 strong, 1 French and 1 British. Each team would dig out from its own shoreline, racing to be the first to the midway point under the channel. The Brits were a tunnelling elite drawn from major worldwide underground projects. Calling themselves the Tunnel Tigers, they set great store by teamwork.
One-man armies don't go very far. You know, it takes quite a few lads to keep something like this going.
Commanding them is Chief Engineer Gordon Crichton.
You had a team who were totally dedicated to building the job.
The French digging team were the underdogs, locally recruited and trained up for the project.
It's the first time any of us have done a job like this. Everyone's proud to be involved.
Leading the French troops was Laurent Leblanc.
I couldn't believe I was actually working on such an exciting and colossal project. For me, it was absolutely incredible.
The Channel Tunnel would run twice as long underwater as any previous tunnel. The task facing the teams was huge. They had to dig 2 main rail tunnels, plus a central service tunnel, together as wide as a 4-lane motorway. 245 cross passages, crucial escape routes in the nightmare scenario of a fire or accident in the tunnel. Above the tunnels, vents to release the huge air pressure from speeding trains. And giant crossover caverns, allowing trains to divert from one tunnel to the other to allow for maintenance. It all added up to a staggering 153 kilometers of tunnel to be dug. As the dig began, the tunnellers were conscious of the vast scale and the real dangers of the task ahead. Above their heads, 100 metres of seawater and rocky seabed.
Every day you wonder what you're going into. There's only one way in and one way out. Noisy, hot. You just think, what have I got myself in for, really?
Ahead of these tunnelling foot soldiers stood a 17 million-ton wall of earth and rock. It's not a job for claustrophobics. The job would push the men to the limit, but it would also make big demands on the technology of the day. Meet the tunnel boring machines. These underground leviathans spearheaded the Channel Tunnel dig. They were 200 metres long. That's the length of 2 football fields. They weighed 1,100 tonnes apiece, as much as a World War II destroyer. And they were twice as wide as a tank. Yet, as Gordon Crichton reveals, the way that TBMs work is surprisingly simple.
Imagine this is the bed of the channel. The machine is rotating underneath the sea, and as it rotates, the spoil from the tunnel is taken out the back, put into railway wagons and carried to the surface for disposal. Also, as it rotates, it erects a lining, a support round it, which is the permanent lining.
Expert tunneller Brendan Riley knew how central the TBMs were to the dig.
Basically, the machine is a mini factory. The factory is provided with power, it's provided with water, it's provided with electric. It's a workshop of the machine, preventive repairs. Basically, it's self-contained. It's got everything.
12 French and British TBMs excavated the tunnels 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The TBM's high-tensile forged steel blades carved out 10 tons of rock with every turn. The biggest machines cost £10 million each, but as they've been specially designed for this one job, at the end they would simply be scrapped. The race between French and British tunnellers would be won or lost by their TBM's rate of progress. The Brits had the fastest machines, devouring up to 75 metres and 36,000 tonnes of rock a day. The French machines were 25% slower, but did have a key advantage. Their cutting heads were protected by a waterproof housing that allowed them to work on safely, even through waterlogged soil. 1 month into the tunnel dig, with the ground staying dry, the speedier British TBMs began to get ahead. Every day, hundreds of concrete slabs were shipped in to line the tunnel roof as it was dug. They were as big as a family car and 3 times as heavy. This is no ordinary concrete. Specially made to a recipe using granite, it's stronger than the stuff they use to build nuclear reactors. The TBM's powerful hydraulic arms pushed the slabs into place, forming the tunnel wall. The TBMs had to be kept supplied with slabs and constantly moving forward. British Chief Engineer Crichton knew that the schedule was tight. And with the tunnel's £1.3 billion budget all put up by private finance, government bailout was not an option. With the dig costing £1 million a day, each hour's overrun would add £40,000. By January 1988, the Anglo-French tunnelling race was hotting up. But the Brits were holding on to their lead. The rivalry underground is keeping the dig on schedule, but speed isn't everything. Success relies on keeping both tunnels precisely on target. If they stray off course, lives could be at risk. It's enough to daunt the boldest of engineers. The Channel Tunnel Project, the longest undersea tunnel in the world. Two rival teams of French and British workers were each digging out from their own shoreline. The plan, to meet midway under the English Channel. The tunnellers' goal was to win the race for the midpoint. But what kept the engineers awake at night was much more fundamental. The fear that the two tunnels wouldn't meet up. If the two tunnels missed each other, that would mean last-minute course corrections, which could create sharp bends. And the high-speed trains that would use the tunnel had to have a broadly straight course to operate safely. The margin for error was frighteningly slim. The tunnels could not deviate by more than 2.5 meters. Being off target was not an option. But lives were at stake too. If the massive tunnel-boring machines strayed off course, they could hit waterlogged ground. The result could be disastrous. Flooding, or worse, tunnel collapse. It was imperative that the TBMs were guided along a safe and accurate route. That meant conducting one of the world's longest and most in-depth underground surveys. Rewind to August 1986, 18 months before tunnelling began. When surveyor Ewart Gladstone took on the job of plotting the tunnel's course, he knew the scale of the challenge he faced.
France you can see over there, that's the French coast. So we had all that way to drive the tunnel and keep it online for that 38 kilometres. Actually, from here it doesn't look too bad, but it's a long, long way.
Plotting an accurate course over such a long distance underground is a surveyor's nightmare. In tunnels, the normal rules of surveying don't apply. Surveyors normally work by measuring a series of angles at control points along the route. It's all a matter of geometry. Above ground, with 360-degree visibility, plotting a course is relatively simple. Ewart Gladstone explains the difference.
The whole road is opened to the air. All the survey control points from which you do the setting out are already established over the whole length.
Underground, there are obvious complications. All the surveyors can see is a wall of rock. They can't see ahead to plot the course. Roads have one other plus point over tunnels. Because they're flat strips on the landscape, they can only go off course in two directions. Left or right. A tunnel occupies a three-dimensional space underground. It can go off course not only left or right, but also up or down. The two halves of the Channel Tunnel had 4 potential ways to miss meeting up. It's like asking a golfer to sink a hole-in-one blindfolded from 34 kilometres. To keep the tunnel on course and on target, the surveyors had to use a secret weapon: geology. Along its underground route, the tunnel would be driven through a layer cake of different soil and rock types with very different consistencies. The geologists needed one stratum that went right across the channel. This stratum would provide a trail to help keep the British and the French tunnellers on course. But it must be exactly the right type of rock for tunnelling. Jean Jean-Luc Desaines was one of the geophysicists charged with tracing the perfect stratum for the tunnel to follow. On the French side of the channel, Desaines began his search. It would have to be waterproof to resist flooding, and compact enough so it wouldn't collapse during the dig. In these cliffs, Desaines found his prize. Water poured over this seam of rock without soaking in, evidence that it was waterproof.
The soft rock, impervious, so no water in the tunnel. This is a perfect situation for boring a tunnel.
It's called blue chalk. But it was one thing to identify the ideal rock, another to discover its course. Geologists drilled a series of boreholes into the seabed and dropped probes that fired sound waves deep underground. The aim, to measure changes of speed in the sound waves as they passed through different rock and soil layers. It sounds straightforward, but it wasn't. Tracing the course of the blue chalk meant sinking 12 of these boreholes right across the channel, a tricky task in one of the world's busiest sea lanes.
You have a high traffic of vessels. You have tide, you have waves, so it's a difficult place for making accurate investigations.
The geologists concluded the blue chalk would provide a feasible route across the channel. If they were wrong and the TBMs left the waterproof strata, they could hit waterlogged ground, with devastating consequences, flooding or even tunnel collapse. Spring 1988, 3 months into the Channel Tunnel dig. The tunnellers were gouging their way through the rock deeper and deeper underground. Standing between the tunnellers and the risk of flood was the TBM's laser guidance system. Laser guidance is commonly used to keep above-ground structures like roads on course, but underground it had to be used in a more imaginative way. Instead of looking ahead to see where they were going, the tunnellers looked back to where they'd been. Laser beams continually scanned backwards to the tunnel's start point to compare it with the TBM's changing location. Computers then checked this data against the surveyor's course coordinates. For tunneler Brendan Riley, the laser guidance system was one of the TBM's most impressive features.
As the machine moves forward, the laser monitors the change in movement to say whether the machine is moving left or right or up or down. With that information fed back into the computer, it compares that information where the TBM should be at that known point in time and gives that information back to the driver to say whether he needs to steer up or steer right.
As the tunnel face moved further from dry land, conditions for the men got worse. Engineering manager Ian Fugeman recalls the scene.
Anybody going to work had to travel in a cramped train up to 22 kilometres out to the place of work.
By the end of the dig, the workers' trains had clocked up enough miles to go to the moon and back 4 times. This far underground, keeping the air fresh is a major challenge. A massive ventilation system pumped air to the tunnel face. But the men still face the risk of encountering toxic gases.
The further in you are, the warmer it gets, the less air. We carried respirators with us. If there was an accident, we'd have enough air to breathe with.
But Chief Engineers Gordon Crichton and Laurent Leblanc, the frontline commanders of the tunnel dig, were starting to breathe easier. The schedule was holding up, and so was the layer of blue chalk. But what happened next came without warning. March 1988. The service tunnel on the British side. Suddenly, what no undersea tunneler ever wants to see. Water. Thousands of gallons of it flooding into the tunnel. Work comes to a halt.
Cause panic. Oh, we have to stop straight away because you don't know exactly what you're going into.
But Gordon Crichton must act fast to find out where the water is coming from. Is this just a random pocket of fresh water? Or is the sea itself breaking through? He tastes the water, and it's salty.
We knew we had a path right to the channel itself. We knew it was serious.
It's disastrous news. What's coming into the tunnel is seawater. The men know that above their heads there's 3,000 billion tons of it. The pressure on the seafloor 50 meters above is enough to crush a car like a beer can. Now, in places, the water starts to burst through with the force of a fire hose, 300 litres a minute. Then, a crack appears in the tunnel roof. Rocks start to fall. The water is pouring through fissures and loosening lumps of the tunnel roof. The British tunnellers might just be on the edge of disaster. If the cracks worsen, they might let in enough water to weaken the tunnel. Ultimately, it might even lead to the tunnellers' biggest fear: collapse. Chief Engineer Crichton must find a way to plug the leaks, or they could face catastrophe. But how could this be happening? An 18-month survey identified the special layer of rock called blue chalk that was meant to be waterproof. But the geologists are quick to point out that surveys based on sound waves can reveal the course of a rock layer, but they can't give a definitive picture of the rock's quality. Now it turns out that the stratum of rock the tunnel is driving through is fractured, riddled with fault lines and cracks, something the surveyors could not have foreseen. Back in the British tunnel, Engineer Crichton averts disaster. The men plug the leaks and concrete liners are replaced by stronger cast iron versions. Crisis over for now. The tunnel tigers start to inch forward again. But the fractured ground stretched on, and the atmosphere was edgy.
Every ring that you cut, you were just hoping that it was going to be good ground that was there.
But there were more delays as the leaks short-circuited the TBM's electrics. The clock was ticking. With every day, the costs were mounting. And the overspend was running into tens of millions. The French side, meanwhile, had also hit water.
We did indeed hit water. That made the job more difficult. A lot of water always makes the work harder.
But the French had been forewarned about fractured rock on their side. Features in the geology made it much simpler to analyse. Now the French decision to opt for waterproof tunnel boring machines finally started to pay off. Slower than the British TBMs so far, they now gave the French a serious edge.
We decided to use tunnel boring machines that were totally enclosed, totally watertight. These could resist any level of water leakage, no matter how severe.
Meanwhile, the Brits slogged through the leaks and falling rocks and prayed for better ground. Workers rigged a form of makeshift armour plating on their TBM and pressed on. January 1989. After a tortuous 9 months, the British team finally hit drier ground. Massively behind, the pressure to catch up was now intense.
Everybody worked long hours. We had to do it to the time, we had to do it to the programme.
But at last, the Tigers were smiling.
The ground conditions come right, everything seemed to fall in place, and then we started taking off.
The British tunnellers fought their way back into the race.
We've done over 400 metres quite a few times in a week, and I personally think we could have done the half kilometre.
But success came with a sting. The British progress started to stretch the supply of lining slabs. If the slabs ran out, their dig would grind to a halt, with a multi-million-pound metre ticking. January 1990. The French and British tunnelling teams were 2 years into digging the record-breaking Channel Tunnel. The competition between the two countries was fierce as they dug out from their coastlines. If all went to plan, the tunnels would meet up some 18 kilometres out, midway under the English Channel. Flood and rockfalls on the British side nearly spelt disaster and set progress back weeks. But now the Brits were catching up again, and the race for the halfway point was back on with a vengeance. But there's more to building a tunnel than high-speed digging. Above ground, a huge round-the-clock operation kept the project fed with vital supplies. And the most crucial ingredient of all, concrete. Each slab weighs as much as a pickup truck. The French and the British together need 750,000 of them to line the tunnel. In Britain, special trains carrying 4,500 tons of slabs, enough to construct 100 average houses, speed back and forth to the coast. But the British team was about to hit another problem. The flat French shoreline provided plenty of room to store slabs close to their tunnel mouth. But 50-metre cliffs on the British side hugely restricted storage space. And as their tunnelling rate increased, space got tighter and tighter. If it ran out altogether, the supply chain would slow, the dig falter, and the mounting overspend could spin out of control. The British TBMs were munching their way through the tunnel, but without slabs to line the roof, they would soon grind to an expensive halt. Luckily, somebody had a brainwave. Every day the TBMs produced up to 36,000 tons of unwanted rock and earth known as spoil. Why not use it to solve the storage problem? The spoil could be deployed to extend Britain's coastline out to sea, providing desperately needed space. It was an audacious plan. 17 million tons of spoil, enough to fill over 2,000 Olympic swimming pools, were dumped into the sea. The storage problem was solved, and Britain grew by 90 acres. That's the area of 68 football pitches. Underground, the moment of truth was approaching as the French and British tunnellers edged ever closer together, towards breakthrough point. The tunnellers were intent on reaching the middle first. The engineers had bigger worries. After 3 years and 37 kilometres of tunnel dug, would the two halves actually meet in the middle? The British reach what they think is the rendezvous point first, but are they anywhere near the French? As a small drill bites through the soil, a current of fresh air wafts through. Air from France. French and British workers raced to punch through the last few centimetres of rock that have separated the two nations since the Ice Age. And then, an epoch-making moment.
They're through! They're through! They're through! Hey!
And it's British tunneler Graham Fagg who takes the first step into French territory and into the history books.
To me, it's just fine for a day. I'm just an individual who was part of a team.
To see Graham making that connection and putting his head through the hole and disappearing into France, as it were, for the first time, that was fantastic.
For the first time in 13,000 years, Britain was reconnected to the European landmass. And the surveyors were vindicated. The tunnels didn't just meet, they met a minuscule 35 centimetres off target, the width of a portable TV screen.
No one had ever done it before, over 38 kilometres. From a surveyor's point of view, that is a unique achievement.
The tunnel tigers basked in their achievement.
I think it's great. We're getting past halfway, so I suppose in a way we beat the French.
So the British won the tunnelling race. But if the French had got to the RV point first, there would have been a wait while the Brits scrambled to catch up. Here's why. Job done, the TBM's only value was a scrap. But two machines were stuck head-to-head in a monster gridlock. One side's machine had to go. But what do you do with an 1,100-ton TBM that's past its use-by date? Bury it. It was agreed that the British TBM would dive below its French counterpart to be entombed forever, 100 metres below the surface of the channel. As man and machine were parted after 3 years, it was a poignant moment for the tunnel tigers.
You see the machines buried and you get a bit of a twinge, you know.
The French TBM was towed to Britain to be scrapped, so the Brits made the first breakthrough, but a French vehicle took the first trip under the channel. Over the following months, the 4 other main tunnels met up in a flurry of breakthroughs. The tunnellers carved out hundreds of linking cross passages every few hundred metres. They drilled out the air pressure shafts. They finished off the crossover caverns. May 1991, the Channel Tunnel was finally dug.
The most important thing is that you can stand behind us and look straight through, and that's it.
For the French too, there was a tremendous sense of the significance of the moment.
It's an historic moment. Napoleon tried to build a tunnel but failed. Now we have one Europe.
But behind the scenes of celebration, there was one group who weren't quite so jubilant, the tunnel's financial backers. The French and British might have dug the world's longest undersea tunnel, but delays saw the budget soar from 1.3 billion to over £2 billion. And the job of building the international transport network serving the tunnel had only just begun. As the tunnellers headed home, another army of workers took over. They would build 2 huge terminals on either side of the channel, lay 195 kilometres of railway track, and to extract the heat generated by high-speed trains, fit a giant cooling system equal to 250,000 domestic fridges. They would also build new trains designed to carry cars, trucks and people through the tunnel. But if the tunnel's investors had any hopes that Phase 2 of the project would come in on time or budget, they were in for a big disappointment. 2 years later, overruns had driven the spend higher than ever. The terminals, the track, the trains, they all bust the budget. May the 6th, 1994, the Queen and French President Mitterrand opened the Channel Tunnel. A year late. Delays and interest charges had racked the total cost up to £10 billion, enough to launch 33 space shuttles.
Financial institutions of many countries collaborated to finance this, the biggest privately funded construction project ever undertaken.
But business wasn't booming. At first, the tunnel trains could only take trucks. It was 6 months before the tunnel could handle cars and passengers. A cross-channel trip by ferry from Britain to France takes an hour and a quarter. Using the tunnel slashed the journey to just 35 minutes. But take-up was low. Some speculated that people were fearful of being underground if there should be a disaster. Meanwhile, high interest rates and massive competition from ferries and airlines dragged the tunnel even deeper into debt. And then, just when things seemed at rock bottom, everyone's worst fears were realized. By 1996, the Channel Tunnel has been open for over a year, but business is poor, and the tunnel is about to face its darkest hour. November the 18th. Sangatte, on the French side of the Channel Tunnel. 9:48 p.m. Freight train number 7539 approaches the tunnel, bound for England. On board, a deadly cargo. A truck has caught fire and is gushing smoke and flame. Railside workers had spotted the blaze and immediately reported it, but the train is already several kilometres in, under the sea. One of the 31 passengers on board is British truck driver Brian Shilton.
And all of a sudden we started to see this black, jet black smoke rising, coming in from the floor of the carriage.
The truck drivers are riding in a passenger coach behind the engine. The fire starts 400 metres away, but it's getting closer. Bill Welsh of the Kent Fire Brigade will later that night find himself face to face with the Channel Tunnel fire.
We were talking about the most severe fire you can ever imagine. It really was like looking in to a furnace, if you can imagine what that's like.
Welsh's first concern, how to rescue the passengers.
There's no way out. It's not like you're in a house, you can get out the doors, the windows. When you're in a tunnel, you're relying on someone coming to rescue you.
At 9:51 p.m, the Fire Control Centre advises the driver to keep going. Speed helps suppress the flames, and the train is only 15 minutes from the other side. US fire expert Ed Comeau will later help British and French investigators sift through the charred wreckage of the train.
Part of the standard operating procedures is to allow the train to continue through and emerge on the other side where they would fight the fire and suppress it.
The train accelerates deeper into the tunnel, racing for the English coast. At 9:57, the crisis takes a horrifying turn. A dashboard light warns the driver that a wagon fitting has come loose. The train must stop or risk derailment. As the train comes to a halt, the fire erupts. It quickly burns through the train's power supply.
The lights went in darkness. It was just like something out of hell.
Within 3 minutes of the power loss, toxic black smoke engulfs the train.
We was lying on the floor, all choking. 1 or 2 drivers started to vomit.
The train is 19 kilometres into the tunnel, but safety lies just a few metres away in the service tunnel. To reach it, the passengers must find one of the cross passages in the main tunnel walls. But the smoke is too thick to see the way out.
The driver and the crew could not see where the door was. They couldn't see the safety lights. So they were stuck there. They were waiting for someone to come and open that door and help them.
10:02 p.m. Using fire sensors, controllers identify a hot spot in the main tunnel that they think must be the train. They open the nearest cross-passage door remotely. The controllers now direct French firefighters into the central service tunnel to cross-passage door number 4101. It's the one they think is nearest to the passenger coach. It's a 15-minute journey, and for the stranded passengers, time is running out. In the tunnel, trucks are now exploding.
Tyres on the lorries all blowing. The train was just rocking from side to side on the track, and that was actually happening while we was lying on the floor.
The temperature climbs. At its peak, it will reach 1,000 degrees centigrade. So hot, the train's steel wheels are welded to the rails, and the concrete lining of the tunnel itself becomes dangerously unstable.
It's where the moisture within the concrete expands and then explodes out with terrific force. Very much, I would imagine, like shrapnel in a war situation.
10:20 p.m. Firefighters arrive at cross-passage door 4101. But to their horror, there's no train. It's the wrong door. The chances of saving the passengers are receding fast. Fire is raging through a train halted 19 kilometres into the Channel Tunnel. In choking smoke, 31 passengers await rescue. The flames are just 200 metres away and closing fast. But firefighters have gone to the wrong section of the tunnel. Aboard the train, the conductor spots a bubble of clean air through the smoke. There must be an open escape route nearby. It's their only chance. The passengers must leave the carriage and plunge into the inferno.
We saw the flames rushing alongside the train, the vehicles blowing up and tyres and tanks going on the trucks. I would say we came within minutes of dying, all of us.
For 7 minutes, the passengers wander blindly through the acrid smoke. With eyes streaming and lungs bursting, they reach the open cross-passage door. At 10:24 p.m, the passengers finally find the firefighters. It's 40 minutes since the fire was reported.
We was just very, very lucky on that night to be alive today.
No lives were lost, but it was a grim reminder of the perils of an emergency so far underground.
One or two of them were near to collapse. They'd endured 20 minutes of having to breathe in acrid smoke, and it was very fortunate that we didn't lose any lives. But the system worked. The system worked.
After the fire, an urgent safety review. It results in improved fire sensors, better emergency lighting, and promises a quicker future response from firefighters. The tunnel was repaired and reopened in just 2 weeks, but the damage to its image would take longer to overcome. 1999, the last year of the century, the last year of the millennium. At last, a good year for the Channel Tunnel. More than 5 million cars and trucks travelled on the underground rail link between the British and French coasts. Nearly 7 million people use the passenger service that links London, Paris and the Belgian capital, Brussels. 10 years on, and nearly 150 million people have travelled through the tunnel. That's more than twice the UK's population. Now, Britain and France are to be brought even closer via a new high-speed rail link from London to the tunnel entrance. Trains reaching 300 kilometres per hour will speed passengers to Paris in 2 hours 15 minutes, half the journey time of the pre-tunnel era. So far, the line's on budget and on schedule. It will complete a vast pan-European transport network. At its heart, the Channel Tunnel itself. 11 men lost their lives while building the Channel Tunnel. For British Chief Engineer Gordon Crichton, the tunnel stands as a permanent testament to them and to all those who built it.
People were proud to work on it, and I really think that's what saw it through at the end.
For Crichton's opposite number, Laurent Leblanc, the tunnel represents a personal best.
For me, it's a great memory, the experience of my life without a doubt.
An undersea tunnel to unite two nations with such an ambivalent relationship seemed an eccentric plan. But the Channel Tunnel has overcome scepticism, grappled with a debt mountain, and endured fire and flood. It's become one of the engineering wonders of the modern world and changed the shape of Europe forever.